Hello and welcome to the Russian Empire History Podcast, the history of all the peoples of the Russian Empire. I'm your host, JP Bristow, and this is Season 1, The Forest, the Steppe, and the Birth of the Russian Empire, and Episode 55, Volga Bulgaria before the Mongols. First, a big thank you to new Boyar Daniel, who joined through the new Supercast option, and thank you again to everyone subscribing through Apple or Spotify. Last episode, we heard about life in medieval Bulgaria, a thriving and prosperous kingdom that, much like Rus, had been booming for the last couple of centuries. For the first couple of centuries after their arrival on the Volga, the Bulgars were clearly the dominant power in the region. The rulers of Bulgaria, the Jafarids, consolidated their rule within Bulgaria, developed the usual ambitions to expand their borders, establish dominance over their neighbours, and reinforce their control over their trade networks. While this meant that they looked west, the Rus, as we have already heard, were moving east as Suzdalia emerged, with ambitions of its own that were no longer focused on Kiev and the south. Conflict would become inevitable. Most of the cities of Bulgaria were major trade centres, and trade continued to develop right up to the Mongol invasion. By the 10th century, Bulgaria was already the leading centre for the transit trade in Eastern Europe, and by the 12th century this was increasingly supplemented by their own manufactured goods and agricultural products. Trade was so important to Bulgaria that some earlier historians have treated it as entirely populated by merchants, which was not quite the case. As we saw with other trades in the last episode, commerce was an increasingly specialized profession. As with those trades, when we assess trade in Bulgaria, we rely almost entirely on foreign writers and the archaeological record. We know that some cities had permanent markets, including with quarters permanently allocated to Rus and other foreign merchants. There were also seasonal markets, and Ibn Fadlan records that the Rus had their own wooden houses near the site of the summer market. He also notes that the Bulgars were ready to set up a market any time an opportunity to make money arose. There was a network of caravanserai across the region with accommodation, sometimes brick-built saunas, horse and camel stables. A variety of things were used for payment. There were some coins, local and imported from Central Asia, but trade with the Rus treated coins as specie used by weight. Furs were by all accounts the most common medium exchange from the 9th century all the way through to the Mongol invasion. All records mentioning trade with the Bulgars agree on the use of furs, that there was a set rate of exchange for different furs, both when changing one fur for another and when exchanging fur for coins or metal. In the pre-Mongol period, coins did become more common. Besides the limited supply of Bulgarian coins, there were international sources of coinage. Samanid dirhams were most common, of course. Although the Samanids were rich and heavily focused on trade, their coins were not as high quality as the Abbasid coins that had already been reaching the region for a couple of centuries. Other coins from around the Islamic world also made their way to Bulgaria. Until the last 25 years, it was thought that there were no Western coins in Bulgaria, but excavations at the Kazan Kremlin and elsewhere have since turned up Czech, German, and other coins. Going the other way, Bulgarian coins have been found at a number of sites in Scandinavia. Bulgarian coins bear the name of the emir and the caliph. As there were no silver deposits in Bulgaria, they would have melted down Central Asian dirhams to make them. As the northernmost Islamic kingdom, Bulgaria was a key source of furs, wax, honey, and isinglass that were hard to procure elsewhere, and, of course, of slaves. Islamic sources record a continuous stream of caravans travelling between Bulgaria and Khwarezmia, which emerged as the dominant power in Central Asia between the fall of the Samanids and the Mongol invasion. Bulgaria imported writing paper from Samarkand, fabric and carpets from Tabaristan, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Byzantium, and large quantities of sword blades that local craftsmen made into finished weapons. Imports from the West were more sporadic and appear to have mostly come through Rus. Goods included glass, ceramics, and bronze items. After Vladimir the Great raided the Bulgars in 985, there were a number of clashes with the Rus over the following years, which resulted in a trade agreement between them in 1006. This agreement entitled Bulgar merchants to trade all over Rus, with Rus merchants receiving reciprocal rights in Bulgaria. As we have seen in other cases, military clashes were often linked to trade. Conflicts between the Bulgars and Rus was not common and typically followed this pattern. For example, the Bulgars attacked Gorodets Murom and Ryazan in retribution for attacks on Bulgar merchants in Rus territory. This campaign resulted in a new peace agreement securing free trade for both countries' merchants. These peace treaties might seem at odds with the Bulgars' slave trading activities, but we should note that the Rus themselves supplied the Bulgars with Slavic slaves, and we should not be regarding all the Slavic tribes of the region as integrated into Rus at this stage. Recall that according to the tale, the Rus regarded the Viatici, whose territory was within reach of Bulgaria, as dangerous and outside of their control for a couple of centuries after they had begun claiming that territory. The Bulgars did not retain many of these enslaved people for themselves. The absolute majority were sold into Central Asia, where many were purchased for the caliph's slave armies. Trade was the most important business of the Bulgar state, which had a well-developed system of regulation and control. Average travel times were recorded, and networks of caravanserai and other stations where caravans could stop were built across the territory. These enable historians to reconstruct the trade routes. The route from Bulgaria to Kiev was obviously highly regulated. It was divided into stages with stopping points, customs posts, and military garrisons. There was another major route which became a point of contention between Bulgaria and Rus. This was the Kama River route to the Urals in the north. The Bulgars expanded in this direction quite early, building towns and establishing influence over the Finno-Ugrian inhabitants of the region. They also expanded along the Vyatka, where territory that had already been claimed by the Rus became Bulgarian with Bulgarian towns. The Bulgars were thereby controlling the east-west trade corridor as well as the north-south Volga corridor. We're talking about quite a large area. It is over 1,200 kilometers from the site of Bilar to the Bulgar trading town found at Roshtetlinskaya on the Obva, a tributary of the Kama in what is now Perm Krai. Merchants traveling along the river could travel 20 to 30 kilometers a day going upstream and 70 to 75 kilometers a day on the downstream trip. So allowing for rests, a round trip would take over 3 months. In winter, merchants travelled by sled on the frozen rivers, which was actually faster, as they could travel around 60 kilometers a day in both directions. This trade route is well described by Muslim authors who state that it was carried on all year round. According to the Muslim sources, the inhabitants of this region were called the Chuliman. As well as trading with the Bulgars themselves, they were intermediaries in the trade with their neighbours, the Bashkirs, and Siberia. As the best source of furs, the Siberian taiga was an important source of trade goods for the Bulgars, and this route remained important even after the Mongol conquest. Bulgarian metal and ceramic goods have been found all over western Siberia, along with other items from the Islamic world that would have reached Siberia through the Bulgars along this route. The Kama route was, in all likelihood, just as regulated and organized as the Bulgaria to Kiev route, but has not been as well investigated. By the 12th century, Novgorod was expanding its control over the northeastern trade and pushing into the Ural Mountains itself. Suzdalia, meanwhile, looked to expand eastward and cast covetous eyes on the Volga. Soon border fortresses would be built to assert their claims, and the skirmishing between Bulgaria and Rus would become more serious. Like the Rus, the Bulgars underwent a military evolution over the period from their arrival on the Volga to the Mongol invasions. In some aspects, it was a similar process. While the Rus took on influences from the steppe to improve their capability against mounted nomad forces, the Bulgars adopted weapons and tactics from the Rus as they transitioned into a sedentary society. One of the most noticeable changes in the archaeological record was in their swords. Traditionally, steppe swords had been short, although they had gradually grown longer over the centuries. They were typically a single-bladed weapon intended primarily for chopping down from horseback, with a curved saber-type blade becoming increasingly prevalent. In the 10th century, Volga warriors were carrying a saber around 85 centimeters long, with a curve of less than 2 centimeters. By the 13th century, sabers had grown to 110 centimeters long, with a more pronounced curve of up to 6 centimeters. Bulgarian sabers retained a fairly narrow blade, but did start to move to a partial double edge. One interesting thing was a lugged clip running around 5 centimeters along the blade. This was at least partially intended to protect the sheath, but it is also thought to have been used for some kind of special fencing move, although the details are not known. This component also came to be almost universally adopted by the Mongols of the Ulus of Joshi. As mentioned a few minutes ago, the Bulgars imported many sword blades from Central Asia to be finished locally. As well as fitting hilts and guards, the blade itself would be decorated. The most common decoration was Arabic words or phrases in Kufic script, but examples have also been found of swords with Armenian biblical inscriptions and crosses. This indicates that despite the change in religion, the main role of these inscriptions was the same as it had been in pagan times: a good luck charm, protective incantation, or declaration of the bearer's connection to God, rather than an indicator of the warrior's beliefs. The development of the saber indicates that there was an increasing role for close combat cavalry battles. The hilts, pommels, and guards changed even more than the blades over this time, as greater protection for the user and skillful fencing techniques became more important to warriors, whether on horseback or on foot. The distribution of sabres in Bulgarian society is not entirely clear, but it does appear to have been a weapon for the elite. Skilled swordsmanship requires extensive practice and training, and that requires the means and opportunity. There are some indications from Muslim writings that the saber became a symbol of authority and status. Straight, double-edged swords have also been found in Bulgaria, but only in small quantities. The ones that have been found have been identified as made on the Rhine and were found only in large cities. These swords likely belonged to warriors from the local leaders' comitatus, just as the Rus družinas included foreign warriors, often of Turkic origin. We know that there were Rus warriors in service with Bulgar nobles, as well as Swedes, Hungarians, and Poles, who often got called Rus by the Muslim writers. Bulgars also carried throwing spears with poles around 1.5 meters long, while their infantry used spears with a longer, thicker pole up to 3 meters, and some cavalry carried 4-meter lances. Like swords, they underwent a considerable evolution over the history of Bulgaria. Before the 11th century, lances had narrow tips for penetration, while other spears had a leaf-shaped tip. In the 12th and 13th century, there was a proliferation of spear types intended to make them more effective for different fighting situations. The most common cavalry spearhead became an elongated, four-sided blade, think an X-shaped cross-section, around 20 centimeters long, with a strongly reinforced core and neck, clearly intended for use in a high-impact charge attack. 3 types of infantry spears became common. Elongated spearheads on longer poles were used when fighting cavalry. Broad, leaf-shaped spearheads were used against infantry, in both cases combined with javelins for a ranged attack. Rather than sabres or swords, the infantry carried battle axes with smallish, wedge-shaped head mounted on an 80-centimeter handle. Axe heads became narrower and pointier towards the 13th century as chainmail became more common. As cavalry armor became heavier towards the end of our period, maces, which could cause a concussive injury even without piercing the armor, became increasingly common. Across the East European region, the Rus and the Bulgars were the only people to adopt the mace. We have no evidence that they were used by any of the Finno-Ugrian peoples, and they were very rare among the Kipchaks. By the 13th century, they may have been the most common secondary weapon for the Bulgars, after the spear or lance. The Bulgars were known for their chainmail armor. Several Muslim writers describe chainmail as part of the normal equipment of the Bulgarian cavalry, and the Bulgars exported chainmail to Central Asia. Before the 10th century, chainmail was combined with leather armor, then with lamella, and then iron began to become more common. Cuirasses and helmets were the most common types of armor. In the late stage, the size of the iron plates used to form the chest and back pieces increased, and metal scales were also used to cover the rest of the leather backing, which had previously been left unarmored for better mobility. This armor was highly flexible and very effective, and became increasingly common across the region after the Mongol conquest. Bulgar helmets were of the domed conical type common across almost all steppe peoples. The shape was intended to deflect blows and thereby reduce the impact. The Bulgars also appear to have adopted visors from the west. Also adopted from the west were shields, round for cavalry, almond-shaped for infantry. You're probably wondering about archery, and yes, the Bulgars were excellent archers who retained their steppe traditions of bowmanship and tightly coordinated maneuvers. They continued to use Turkic-style composite bows, and the main development over the Bulgarian period was the proliferation of armor-piercing arrowheads of various shapes. Overall, the militaries of Bulgaria and Rus at the beginning of the 13th century were rather similar. The Bulgars wore lighter armor and used mobile-mounted archery where the Rus tended to stand and shoot, but otherwise they were converging around similar equipment and tactics in open battle. The difference in armor can be explained by the Rus also fighting against Western armies, while the Bulgars' main opponents other than the Rus were Finno-Ugrians and Kipchaks, both of whom were highly mobile and more lightly armed. In the 12th century, the Bulgarian military developed a more complex hierarchy that was no longer based on the emir's own personal comitatus and hired foreign warriors. Instead, the core of the military became the iuri, consisting of the kasham, a military service nobility who were rewarded with land for their service and the personal troops they provided, and the beks, regional rulers who maintained their local comitatus and provided it to the emir when asked. In wartime, the iuri would be supplemented with the chirmesh, town and city militias, as well as the usual hired warriors and contingents from allies. The emir remained the supreme military commander until the Mongol conquest, and the available information suggests that Bulgaria maintained a high level of internal unity and centralization, which enabled it to be militarily effective, despite being smaller than the fractured Rus. Kurgali was a Bulgar poet whose most famous work is the Tale of Yusuf, which is one of the fragments of Bulgar literature that has survived thanks to its wider popularity and translations into other languages. Although details of his biography are lost, Kurgali likely studied in Central Asia or traveled to other Muslim countries, as his work contains Persian and Arabic loanwords and shows some familiarity with Middle Eastern customs. He most probably died at Bira during the Mongol invasion. The Tale of Yusuf includes a passage describing the emir reviewing the Bulgar army. Quote, "And once a month Yusuf would pick a certain day to muster all his troops. A horse would start to neigh, as he felt his trappings on his unruly mane, thus calling each and everyone to mount a campaign. And warriors old and young rabble and delete, would assemble, joined by a host of Beks and their men. The Imamgrib ambassador was ordered to appear and help Yusuf review the troops, front and rear. And everywhere they looked, left and right and up and down, the faces of the soldiers were all around. 200,000 men stood on every side, on saddle and on foot, all of their own kind. End quote. 200,000 is, of course, a bit of an exaggeration. By the early 13th century, Volga Bulgaria had an estimated population of 800,000 to 1,000,000 people. Normal military numbers would likely have been in the range of 15,000 to 20,000 warriors, with perhaps 50 to 55,000 being available when the militias were fully mobilized, as happened during the Mongol invasions. Descriptions of battles in the tale that do not have clearly fanciful numbers attached tend to put the size of the armies, Rus or Bulgar, at between 5 and 10,000, which would appear to be realistic. The Bulgars tended to be defensive rather than aggressive, and made extensive use of fortifications. Although, as already mentioned, they could use raids as a tool to compel negotiations, there were only a few recorded incidents of large-scale attacks on neighbours. In these cases, such as an attack on Yaroslavl in 1152, they attacked when the Knyaz was away with his forces campaigning in southern Rus. The network of fortresses meant that the Bulgars could harry invading forces, Rus or Mongols, with flanking maneuvers, ambushes, and retreats to safety, forcing the invaders to disperse and lose the initiative without enduring a frontal clash. The major cities had multiple rings of defensive fortifications which were equipped with a variety of projectile weapons. The Rus, who did not build this way themselves and were unfamiliar with fighting in these conditions, on several occasions broke through the intentionally weaker outer palisade into the killing ground for these projectile weapons, supplemented by archers, and took heavy losses, which forced them to withdraw. It would take nearly a century for the Rus to succeed in taking a Bulgar fortified city, and even then they had not really developed effective siege tactics. Even the Mongols, who had much greater experience of siege warfare than the Rus, found the Bulgars highly effective. They comprehensively defeated Subotai and Jebe after the Mongols had defeated the Rus at the Khalkha, and repelled two more Mongol campaigns in 1129 and 1232. If you're wondering why the Mongols razed the Bulgar cities to the ground and prohibited them being rebuilt, this is why. That was the punishment for people who dared to resist conquest. The Caliph extended diplomatic recognition to the Bulgars in 922. Given this and the booming trade with the Caliphate, there must have been regular diplomatic exchanges. We do know that some of the Muslim writers we rely on for information about Bulgaria were there as diplomats. These relations were maintained throughout political changes in the Caliphate, the fall of the Samanids, the rise of the Seljuks in the Khwarezmian dynasty. In the later period, Central Asia and Bulgaria also had a shared problem with the Kipchaks, which could have been a reason for them to cooperate. We have occasional reports about Bulgar missions to the Caliphate. In 1024, Emir Abu Ishaq sent money to build 2 mosques in Nishapur region, apparently inspired by a dream. Khwarezmian records refer to generous gifts and treasure sent by the emir, and to correspondence among theological, medical, and legal scholars in Bulgaria and Central Asia. The Bulgars appear to have had good relations with the Turkic nomadic peoples in the Volga and southern Urals since the earliest days of their presence on the Volga. Early burial sites have Orkhus graves side by side with the Bulgars. In the 11th century, Bulgaria began making its influence in the eastern Kama region more forceful, and the Kipchaks were taking over the western steppe. Just as the Chorny Klobuki and other Turkic nomads became formal allies of the Rus in response to the Kipchak expansion, other Turkic groups joined the Bulgars. Ibn al-Athir reports on one instance of 10,000 tents of nomad Turks converting to Islam and being resettled throughout Bulgaria. In the middle of the 12th century, the Bulgars also extended their control south along the Volga to Saksin, the successor to the old Khazar capital of Atil. According to Algarnati, an Andalusian diplomat living in the city, the Bulgars lived all over the city and built a mosque where the people called Suvas prayed, and the Bulgars ruled 40 Orkhus tribes. Although this city was firmly within what was regarded as Kipchak territory, the archaeological record shows that Bulgarian artifacts prevail. It is possible that the Kipchaks recognized the trade benefits of working with the Bulgars, and they may have concluded a formal agreement with them, just as they did with Khwarezm, Georgia, and Hungary, although no evidence has survived. Trouble with the Kipchaks tended to flare up when the Kipchaks were at peace with the Rus. Ayapar Khan, Yuri Dolgoruki's father-in-law, launched a campaign against the Bulgars in 1117. According to the tale, the Bulgars sent the Kipchaks poisoned drinks, and Ayapar drank and died. This incident was a contributing factor to Yuri Dolgoruki undertaking his own campaign against the Bulgars in 1120. It's been a while since we covered it, but I'm sure you will recall that according to some Islamic sources, Sviatoslav defeated the Bulgars and Burtises after he attacked Atil, although there is nothing about this or any consequences it might have had in the tale. Due to this and the absence of any conclusive archaeological evidence, some historians doubt that it ever happened. However, we do know for sure that Vladimir the Great fought the Bulgars with his uncle Dobrynya in an alliance with the Turks. You'll remember that this was the time where the Rus claimed to have won a major victory, but also admitted that they were unable to make the Bulgars pay them tribute and concluded a peace agreement that was to last until the stones start swimming. There were other minor conflicts, but it appears that the Rus and Bulgars generally got along fairly amicably until Suzdalia emerged as a major force. Dolgoruki wanted control over the Volga, and that meant conflict with the Bulgars. Initial raiding by Rus-allied Kipchaks provoked a Bulgar attack on Suzdalia. Initial raiding by Rus-allied Kipchaks provoked a Bulgar attack on Suzdal, where they laid siege to the city and devastated the surrounding countryside. According to the tale, the people of the city were only saved by divine intervention, making the Bulgars leave. Next came Ayapar's campaign, which resulted in his death by poisoning, which led to a Rus punitive expedition in which the tale says Dolgoruki defeated the Bulgars. This was followed by around 30 years of peace. However, Dolgoruki's successors, Andrei Bogolyubsky and Vsevolod Bignest, both ran a fairly aggressive foreign policy, and both once again looked to establishing hegemony over the Volga. They also had propaganda texts created against the Bulgars. One example is the Word of Idols, which viciously attacks the Volga Bulgars for alleged pagan practices so vile that they excluded them from the human race and made it every Christian's duty to destroy them. Other texts focused on the Mother of God's intercession for the Rus when fighting the Bulgars, and miracles wrought by certain icons, such as the Theotokos of Vladimir, to protect the Rus or defeat the Bulgars. We can see this as an important stage in the development of the Rus ideology and Orthodox identity. It appears that the conflict with Suzdalia may have made the Bulgars seek allies among the other Rus knyazes. There's no mention of this in any of the chronicles, and we do not have any other evidence, but the timing of some recorded events suggests that there may have been coordination. For example, the 1152 attack on Yaroslavl, already mentioned, took place while Yuri Dolgoruki was off campaigning against Izyaslav. The Bulgars could simply have been acting on their own intelligence that the city's defenders were away, or they could have been told by Izyaslav. Whatever the case, the attack on Dolgoruki's rear helped Izyaslav. Suzdalia was forced to divert forces to building and maintaining fortresses on the Bulgarian border, rather than campaigning in the south. Andrei Bogolyubsky's aggressive stance against the Bulgars included his own campaigns. In 1164, he led a large army against Brahimov, taking and burning the city, in which was the first clearly successful Rus campaign in the east. However, a new campaign by his sons in 1172 was soundly defeated by the Bulgars. Another one of those occasions when the tale says that the Rus were saved by divine intervention. 2 years later, Bogolyubsky was killed by his boyars, unhappy with his military defeats in Bulgaria and against his Rus rivals. But his son, Vsevolod Bignest, continued his expansionist policies. Bignest invaded Bulgaria in 1183, 1185, and 1205. The first campaign was the biggest, with troops from his allies in Pereyaslav, Smolensk, Ryazan, Kiev, and the Kipchaks. This was no raid. The aim was control of the Volga, and the target was Bilar itself. The Rus forces moved rapidly by river, and the usual Bulgar harassment tactics failed to break them up or slow their progress. They soon surrounded Bilar, but as we've already said, the Rus did not really know how to deal with the city's fortifications. After a siege of 10 days and taking heavy losses from a Bulgar sally, Bignest's allies began to abandon him, and he was forced into a humiliating peace treaty. The campaigns of 1185 and 1205 were nothing more than minor raids. Instead of tackling the Bulgars directly, Vsevolod switched to campaigning against the Mordvins, Uralic peoples east of Suzdalia and northwest of Bulgaria, who had been under strong Bulgar influence. The conflict over trade routes and dominance of the Mordvins continued into the 13th century. In 1220, the Bulgars took Ust-Yug on the Kama and unsuccessfully attempted to take Unja. In response, a Rus army of contingents from Vladimir, Rostov, and Murom sailed down the Volga to the Bulgar town of Orshil. After an exchange by the river, the Bulgars withdrew into the fortified city. This time, the Russians managed to set fire to the outer palisade, and the wind soon carried the fire into the city itself, which fell on the 15th of June. Meanwhile, another Rus army attacked from the Kama, pillaging the countryside and sacking some smaller towns. It seems from the chronicle that the Bulgars were unable to organize their defenses this time, although we do not know why. According to the chroniclers, Yuri of Vladimir, the son of Vsevolod Bignest, was impressed with this success and began planning a major campaign against Bulgaria. The Bulgars sent ambassadors asking for peace, who were turned away empty-handed. A second embassy was sent with the same result. A third embassy was sent, this time laden with gifts, and Yuri finally agreed to establish peace. Some scholars argue that this shows that, contrary to the tale, the campaign against Oshul could not have been that great a success, as the Bulgars succeeded in maintaining the status quo and the Rus gained nothing. Alternatively, the continuing wars between the knyazes in southern Rus may have meant that Yuri did not have the resources to go to war with Bulgaria at the same time. Yuri also built fortresses in the east, including Nizhny Novgorod, at the confluence of the Volga and the Oka. This fortress and then town was the most easterly Rus settlement until the conquest of Kazan in 1552. The ideological standoff between the Orthodox Rus and Muslim Bulgars did continue, though. The tale continues to call them vile pagans, and in 1229 a Christian Rus merchant named Abraham was allegedly tortured to death by the Bulgars for refusing to convert. He was buried in the Christian cemetery of Bila, but a popular campaign in Vladimir demanded his body be sent back to Rus. In 1230 his remains were transferred to Vladimir, where he was immediately canonized and used in anti-Bulgar political propaganda during the campaign against the Mordvins. The competition between Bulgaria and Suzdalia had forced the Mordvins to partially unite under a man named Purgas. He seems to have initially acknowledged Rus overlordship, but then switched sides. Throughout the 1220s, he fought against Vladimir and against another Mordvin leader, Puresh, who was allied with the Rus. In 1229, the Bulgars supported Purgas in a campaign against Puresh, who was defeated and killed. This provoked a Rus response, and an army from Vladimir and Murom laid waste to Purgas' territory, forcing him to flee. This defeat achieved little, though, as within months Purgas was laying siege to Nizhny Novgorod and burning churches and monasteries. This time, Puresh's son, with Rus and Kipchak allies, drove him off. Some scholars have interpreted these wars in the 1220s as a successful Bulgar campaign to distract the Rus with other conflicts and ensure that they were never able to concentrate their armies for a major assault on Bulgaria. The Bulgars did in fact initiate a new peace agreement with Suzdalia, while the fighting with the Mordvins was at its peak. Yuri of Vladimir agreed to their proposal of peace for 6 years, an exchange of prisoners, and the forgetting of all grievances, which, as it included acceptance of the Bulgars' recent expansions on the Kama and Oka, was clearly a success story for the Bulgars. That the Bulgars were succeeding in the rivalry for domination of the Mordvins can also be seen in the Tale of the Destruction of the Rus Land, a description of the Mongol invasions. It surveys the greatness of Rus before the invasion, but notes that the days when the peoples of the Volga had paid tribute in honey to Vladimir Monomach and Yuri Dolgoruki had already passed. Some scholars have argued that the Bulgars' aim in this peace agreement was to build an alliance with the Rus against the Mongols, who they had already encountered on the southern Volga. But this is not mentioned in contemporary descriptions and may not have been possible. The agreements between the Rus and Bulgars were pragmatic. They were based on mutually beneficial trade and the absence of any clear military superiority on either side. As the Rus were unable to take control of the trade routes, they were forced to acquiesce to the Bulgars' demands. But despite this pragmatism, there were obviously severe differences. We do not really know what the Bulgars' attitude to the Rus was. Listeners to the members' episodes will know that their closest Muslim allies in Central Asia made extensive use of holy wars called against their enemies. It's possible that this may have influenced the Bulgar attitude to the Rus as well, but we don't know. We definitely do know that there was a strongly anti-Bulgarian religious trend in Rus society, perhaps influenced by Western crusades. In the event, when the Mongols invade, the Bulgars will call for help, and the Rus will not answer. And although they were at peace for the last years of Bulgaria, it's unlikely that that peace would have been enduring, even if the Mongols had not appeared. Join me next episode as we return to Kiev and the last chaotic decades of Rus. Thank you for listening, and until next time, goodbye.